not sure. Is she getting video? Okay, we got it.
Okay.
I'm not sure if she's getting me now or.
Go up here just for a second. Yeah, you should be. She said she couldn't hear.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, well, in the beginning of this will be not very interesting if you watch it and recording of it. Saint Cyprian of Carthage ends up becoming the bishop in this area. And part of why this is important is because during these early persecutions, Christians are being demanded to confess Christ, they're being demanded to renounce Christ or die. And a lot of Christians are renouncing Christ in the moment, in that crucible, and then feeling very, very bad about it later on and wanting to rejoin the church because they do believe, but in a moment of weakness, they did not confess that in the face of persecution. And now the church is faced with a difficult task. What do you do with those lapsed Christians, with those ones that would not confess? And the confessors, some of whom faced horrible persecution, maybe they were maimed or hurt or their property was taken, are looking at their lapsed brothers and saying, I did it and you didn't do it. Do you really believe, like, how do you make this right? The fact that you really denied Christ at a crucial moment. And so, especially in this hardcore area, there was a lot of pushback on whether or not to let these people back into the church. And Cyprian wanted unity. He was a kind-hearted man who wanted to extend grace. However, when you have the hardline group on the other side, what do? Well, his concern was this, that outside the church, there is no salvation, and we are leaving these people outside the church. They're no longer able to take the Lord's Supper. They're not able to celebrate with God's people. They need a way back inside the church. He cannot have God for his father who has not the church for his mother. So he is not saying that trying to kick people out. He's trying to bring them in with that phrase. And so he comes up with a system for lapsed Christians who denied their faith under threat of persecution to make it right. And it was called penance. And so the original idea of penance was for people to make this public declaration of their sorrow for having denied Christ, but giving them an avenue to get back into the church. This extended great power and influence to the bishops because now they're the ones deciding what it took to get you back into the church. And again, this is started by a guy who's eagerly desiring to have people in the church, to not take the hard line. You can see how penance, especially if you've got a Catholic background, how this can slowly morph over the centuries. So rather than bringing people in, almost becomes a works salvation kind of a thing, and a doctrine that started out trying to help people and ends up hurting people because it wasn't technically a Christian doctrine. Peter didn't have to do a bunch of things before he was forgiven by Christ. He just confessed. And so it's just one of those examples, and there are many throughout church history, of things that started out with a good intention, but the longer it went, the weirder and the more off it kind of got. So this is kind of that a case in point of that.
And
yes.
Quickly, do we know what was involved originally? Were there practical aspects? In other words, a certain, like a probationary period or certain things, which,
yeah,
now, if we put a different name on it nowadays, we might say, well, that's reasonable, you know.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, some of it was just public confession of that sin. It wasn't necessarily doing this many Hail Marys or whatever. Like it early on, it made a certain amount of logic. We're actually going to look at an emperor who has to do penance, and it makes a certain amount of sense, but then you can kind of see how this would slowly, the more entrenched it gets in the bureaucracy of the church, the worse it gets, which shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. So I should point out too that Cyprian ended up dying a martyr's death. So this is a man who himself would confess even under deep trial. So we looked at two of the earlier persecutions, but the third one is the Diocletian persecution. And this is the most intense, most aggressive of the persecutions. And we ought to kind of set the stage. This is what the Roman Empire is looking like. Diocletian has a long, stable reign, but he's a military background kind of a leader. So he's very organized, and he actually divides up the rule of the empire. He's spreading out rule to make it easier to govern the empire. He actually has it set in 4 major districts or quadrants, and it's the different colors listed. So Diocletian was actually in charge of the area, which would be modern day Turkey and Egypt and the Holy Land. But then he had another Augustus who was kind of leading the east, and then they had a second tier leader called a Caesar that was ruling the second portion of that east or west part. And so there end up being kind of like 4 mini capitals that are the main areas where this jurisdiction is being done. And there's really a kind of a resurgence of old Rome to really butcher. It's kind of a make Rome great again kind of a vibe. Like they're trying to kind of rekindle that old paganism of Rome. And this is where the emperor worship and that kind of stuff is starting to increase during Diocletian. And they are dogmatically pagan. There are pagan feast days that you must be a part of. And the real persecution begins in 303 after a botched pagan sacrifice. Pagan priests could not discern the future, which leads you to ask, well, apparently some of those worked other times. I don't know, but they couldn't do it looking at animal entrails. They could not get a clear sign or a clear reading. And the pagan priest blamed Christians who were part of the military, because they do these sacrifices before a military campaign to find out, if their battle is going to be successful. And they couldn't do it because Christians had made the sign of the cross while the sacrifice was going on, because they saw it as demonic and evil. And then it didn't work. So maybe it was demonic and evil. But now the military doesn't have guidance from their pagan gods. Something happened. Something changed in the way they did things, that it was no longer effective. And they saw that as a threat to the military and thus to the empire. No gods are speaking. There is no victory. So now comes the global, permanent, vicious attack on the church because of Christians in the military. And so Christians that are part of the Roman military are some of the first ones that are singled out for persecution, but then it extends. Churches are burned, the Christian leaders are killed, and property is taken from the Christians in those places where it was earlier safe to have buildings. And so one of the people you may have actually heard of is Saint George, patron saint of England, the knight that kills the dragon. That legend doesn't really come out until at least I think the 9th, 10th, or 11th century. Don't quote me on that. But Saint George was almost certainly a Greek Christian who was a Roman soldier and who was martyred, beheaded, and his body dragged through the street as a result of this Roman persecution. So Saint George ends up becoming this. I was looking for paintings of George and the dragon. There are like statues and paintings all over the place. He eventually becomes this very prominent figure in Latin Christendom because he was a soldier, and you can imagine how a chivalry-based society in future centuries is going to look backwards for saints that were also soldiers. And so Saint George kind of becomes one of them. But I do find it interesting that this martyr is symbolized as killing the dragon, which is in some senses that idolatrous state that is Rome. So a man dying for his faith is killing the dragon in the long run. And that is a very Christian idea, that this empire is going to be overthrown, not by armed force, but by faithfulness and sticking to the confession of Christ as Lord. And that's going to actually come up very soon. This is a crisis point for the church. They're under a massive persecution. And meanwhile, the wife of the Caesar of the West is a Christian, and she's praying. We so often, and this church history thing's gonna be no different, we focus on these great men of the faith and their massive accomplishments and all the the things that, the controversies and stuff that they get into in the books they write. However, I have a feeling that if God was teaching church history and was laying out his Hall of Fame, Hall of Faith, it might be a bunch of wrinkly old ladies who pray. That's my personal guess. And so for whatever that's worth, you had a mother who's a Christian in a place of consequence, and she has a son who will one day rule, and she is faithful in praying. And that son is the son of Constantius, and his name is Constantine, who you may have heard of. And he was a bit of I would say, a controversial figure in church history. If you're from the background I'm from, which is vaguely Anabaptist, this is when everything went wrong. Is when Constantine comes on the scene. I have shifted my position on that a bit, but we can get into that. So Constantine's father is the emperor or the Caesar of the western part of the empire. So he's in the capital of Trier, which is on the border of Germany, really close to like modern day Luxembourg, which probably doesn't help you much. It's right in between France and Germany. There's like a little city states there. So anyway, that's where the Roman capital is for that portion of the empire. And Constantine's father is killed in York in England, putting down a rebellion of the Picts. And so Constantine takes over, and his army immediately hails him as not the Caesar, but as Augustus. So they're saying, let's forget that other guy in the, our four-way split here. See if I can back up. We're going to follow you. You're our captain. And so this is a problem for empire unity, because each of the four major rulers kind of is seen as a military commander hero, and your army keeps trying to promote you to the top job instead of the third or fourth place. So what ends up happening is Constantine has a similar kind of trajectory, and him and his army end up going to battle against the Augustus of the West in a battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312, and he fights Maxentius and defeats his army, and Maxentius dies. But the night before that, it's claimed by Constantine that he sees a vision of the cross, or really of the Chi Rho, and which is the symbol of Christ. And he's told in that vision, by this conquer. So he puts it on the shields of his soldiers and marches out and wins the day. And it's a little weird. And I don't know, that story's coming down to us kind of after the fact, so that we don't know if that's really what happened or not. And that's really where some of the controversy with Constantine comes from. Is here's this military man who suddenly takes on the outer appearance of that of a Christian and begins to promote Christianity and the Christian faith. This is the man whose mother was a Christian. And so the question is, was his faith genuine or not? Or was he using it as a political tool? And there definitely is a little bit of controversy over that. Part of the reason why is because he still does things that emperors do. Like one of his sons is accused of raping his second wife. Probably wasn't a credible accusation, but he has him killed. He also doesn't get baptized till almost right before his death, which raises the eyebrows of some people. However, that was actually a very common custom for adult converts during that time. And we talked about that a little bit before, is that people that converted to Christianity did not want to get baptized until late in life, because they did not want to commit more sins while baptized, so that they're not dragging God's name through the mud. Here's this person that says he's a Christian and then he's continuing to sin, and penance is starting to be developed during this time as well. So anyway, there's some weirdnesses there that sound worse on the outside than they might if you lived during that time. The reality is that Christianity was still a very, very, very much in a minority position in the empire. They had just been persecuted. They were actively being persecuted when Constantine takes charge of the West. The Eastern Empire is Galerius and Diocletian. They're the two main persecutors of Christians. And so Constantine marches west to take care of, business, because he's finding out that the Christians are being persecuted. Eventually, at the end of his life, Galerius, who was one of the worst offenders persecution-wise, he basically yields. He says, hey, these Christians they're not going anywhere. They're holding to their confession. And so he gives them an edict of toleration in 311 and says that their duty is to pray to their God for the good of the country. So as long as Christians can be loyal to the nation and desire the good of the nation, I guess we won't persecute them anymore. There's this changeover that finally Christians are going to become tolerated. But more than that, as Constantine heads east, Galerius does this, but then a later emperor decides to kind of go back on it. So Constantine swoops in and is like, no, that won't stand, comes in and takes that guy out and eventually consolidates the entire empire under him. So now he is, like in the old days, he's a proper Caesar where the entire empire is under Constantine. It's not one of four anymore. He kind of is the head of the entire empire now. And he's confessing to be a Christian. I mean, is there a chance that there was some political gain? Maybe, but there was also a massive risk. Like I said, this is a minority. This is a persecuted minority. And here comes a man who converts and wants to promote the welfare of the church. He also, he unveils the Edict of Milan, which gives empire-wide sanction to Christianity. It is now an approved and okay religion. It's not the official religion, but it has gone from being persecuted to being officially tolerated and kind of favored because the emperor is also a Christian. And so this is a massive switch for they were just being persecuted, the hardest they've ever been persecuted. And then in this glorious reversal, the persecutors become, in some ways, kind of converted and now are leading the nation toward a more Christian society. And then the question is that a good thing? And I don't have an answer for that, really. It's something to think about. Is it better to have people not persecuted for their faith? I think we would generally say yes. Like, do we want Christians slaughtered for believing in Christ? No. So in that sense, it's a good thing. But there's some negative consequences that can come from that as well. And we'll kind of see those as we move forward. But in the moment, the people on the ground are overjoyed. The first church historian we'll get to, but he just sings the praises of Constantine because here comes a man who finally delivers the church from oppression and from being hunted down. So Constantine does some other things too. Like this really becomes a kind of a hinge point for the ancient world. And one of the big things, especially for how things unfold for the next almost 1,500 years, is Constantine establishes Constantinople as the new Rome. Does anyone know where Constantinople was? Istanbul. Yeah, there was a song when I was a kid. Istanbul was Constantinople. Anyway, he founds Constantinople as the new capital of the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire is no longer technically Roman because Rome isn't where it's at. Constantinople is where the life of the empire is going to be centered. That's where Constantine is going to be ruling from. And as a result, where the power of the church is going to be shifting farther and farther east. There was a bunch of good reasons for this. The main one is that most of the people lived in the east. This is where the heaviest population was, around Constantinople in modern day Turkey, down through the Holy Land and into Egypt. This is where the majority of the actual population of the Roman Empire was. There's a lot less population in modern day France and Spain and Italy than there was farther east. So it made sense to kind of move the center of your governance to where the actual people were. It's a little bit like having your capital out of like Colorado Springs for our country. So, well, there's not that many people there compared to over here on the East Coast. So it makes a certain amount of sense in that regard. But Constantine begins massive building projects. and they are state-backed buildings of churches. Now, this is the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, Constantinople. This one is the third version of it. So this is not the one that was standing when Constantine founded the city and built it up as his new capital. But he's kind of initiating, like, they dedicate the city and have a church service at this site. And so it's just a reminder that church and state are not at all separate in the ancient world. That's not a thing. Like, it just isn't a thing. The emperor is the head of the pagan religion, and now the emperor, of course, is head of the Christian religion in a sense, because that's what leaders do. Like, there's not this big split in society between religious practices and political practices. They are wedded together. And so it's not something that really is coming to people's minds, especially early on, to have a strong distinction. If anything, Constantine begins to separate them more than what they had been. And we'll see that a little bit as he starts calling councils and things. He is not as heavy-handed as what earlier emperors would have been when it came to the political religious life of the empire. Constantine actually takes a small step back from what earlier emperors would have done. But his influence on the church is still humongous during these first few decades. The first thing that he does is that he changes the geography. So these ruling districts are the ruling districts of the church, but they're also the exact same districts as the state. So the maps are drawn the same. So the influence and the authority of bishops in the church begins to look more and more like the influence and authority of the secular governors and stuff of the Roman Empire. And in fact, a lot of times those bishops take on some like civil cases, like they become sort of kind of judges for certain lower level things. They're not running the military, but like they're connected to the overall functioning of society. The church architecture also begins to change. This is St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And it's very Roman, right? Like the actual architecture of churches starts to reflect the architecture of the Roman world, that it is now a favored and a safe religion to be part of. And there's money flowing like crazy into the church. That's real gold, like we go from this hunted minority who's having their property taken to now the church treasury, or the state treasury, helps fund the church for the whole empire. And so you go from having your leaders killed and beaten and persecuted to the ones that are left suddenly having command of vast wealth and influence over an entire society. So it's a very abrupt change. And this is all happening in the course of about 20 years. So think since 9/11. In that time period, as most of you remember that, the church goes from being completely persecuted to being the front runners in society, even though they're still a minority. But you can imagine the numbers are swelling and growing because, now this is the favored one. So if you didn't really care about the pagan stuff that much, you're just going to slide on over. But you probably still don't care that much about Christianity. You just want to fit in. And so the churches are a lot less maybe pure in doctrine as far as the average attendee of your church is going to go. There's going to be people who are just there because it's comfortable and that's the easy thing. And that's going to cause some issues as the church moves forward. But during this time, Eusebius of Caesarea is really coming on as kind of the first real church historian. He chronicles a lot of the persecutions of the people in those generations prior to Constantine. But then he has effusive praise of Constantine and the fact that he's really turned the tide for the church. Because think about it. Think about what happened. The church goes from being persecuted minority to being the majority religion, and they didn't have to march an army out to do it. Constantine kind of did, but not. It wasn't the church didn't rally the troops for that. That was not something the church did. They were not militarily inclined for 300 years, and yet they just downed the biggest empire in the world, took them from sacrificing to pagan gods to worshiping Christ. That is an amazing reversal of fortune. It was a huge deal. And so Eusebius compliments him and is, as a person, a lot more concerned with peace and unity than doctrine. And both are super important, but if you can only have one, you should probably go with doctrine. As we will see, this is the slap heard around the world. Arius of Alexandria, which Alexandria is in Egypt. So Alexandria is one of the main centers of Christianity in the early church. Arius of Alexandria begins preaching that Jesus was actually a created being of similar substance as God, but not God himself. Very influenced by Greek philosophy, where God is ultimately unknowable. And this gains a large following. And it's disrupting the unity and peace of the church. And Constantine, as the protector of the empire, and thus also the church within it, calls a council. This is the first ecumenical council of the church. It is held outside of Constantinople in Nicea. And the Council of Nicea is brought together to solve this theological crisis. Constantine calls it, but he's not calling the shots on it. He calls all the bishops in the entire empire and brings them together and says, sort this out so the church can have peace, so that these divisive teachings aren't splitting up the church. That's his role. But then he says, you're all here, now do it. And he kind of takes a step back. But it does raise the question, is the church beholding to the state there? Like, do they have to show up just because he said so? And there's some ambiguity there as to what maybe the best way that should be done. But it's not the first time that the church has gathered together to settle things. I mean, even in Acts 15, we have, the church in Jerusalem is calling together to talk about circumcision and what are the rules for non-Jews in church. So those councils have been called before, and lots of times smaller ones of a region are being called, but this is the first one where it's the entire empire. And so the real theological issue is, who is Jesus? It's a good question. How does Jesus relate to the Father? The Gospel of John tells us that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Then the next question, how human is God in Jesus? The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. So is this man Jesus truly God? That's really the main question that Nicea is asking, because Arius is teaching that he's not really. He's the first created being. And the reason he's doing that is because he's trying to fix an earlier heresy. We talked about modalism, where Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are just three different modes of God. It was a way of simplifying the mysteries of the Bible and just making it easy peasy. Problem was, it was also heresy. So Arius is saying, whoa, we are way off. Let's swing it back over here and separate the Father and the Son from each other so that we're not saying they're just the same being in different modes. Problem is, he does what I'm terming the pendulum effect, where you swing too far the other way. That is like, this error is going to happen so many times, you're going to be tired of seeing this slide till we're done. But the pendulum effect is always a temptation for human beings, where you have an idea that's wrong, and you know it's wrong, and you want to correct it, and you overcorrect into something that's just as wrong, but just in a different way. And so that's really what Arius is doing, is he is trying to separate the Father and Son, but he separates them too far. He's not willing to say that Jesus is fully God in quite the same way. In fact, he's saying there was a time when the Son was not. He's the first created being, but not co-eternal with the Father. And this makes some people very upset. And so in the slap heard around the world, apparently there's this old painting of this. But you know who the slapper is? Saint Nicholas. Yes, that's Saint Nicholas. I came to give, this is a meme for me today. I came to give presents to kids and to punch heretics, and I just ran out of presents. So Saint Nicholas, AKA Santa Claus, in reality was a bishop who was so upset with the dangers of Arianism that he, legend has it, slapped or punched Arius at the Council of Nicaea, which is just a reminder that as bad as your church meetings have ever gotten, there probably weren't punches thrown. And so just saying, could be worse. And this was the first ecumenical council, not exactly a ringing endorsement for the whole process, but you can see why they're doing it. They're not why they're punching people, but why they're having this conversation, because it is vitally important. It strikes at the vitals of the faith. Who is Jesus? And so the Nicene Creed is developed out of that council. And this is what it says: I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things, visible and invisible, and in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, begotten of his Father before all worlds, not created, in other words. God of God, light of light, very God of very God, begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father. And so there you go. Nicaea settles it. So it doesn't. I mean, it does settle it theologically, but it doesn't settle it politically. But it is important to remind us that while creeds aren't necessarily the exact words of the Bible, they help clarify those words and bound our thinking in a way that stays biblical and doesn't drift off into other ideas. And that's why we're in a creedal church that reads this stuff Sunday mornings from time to time, and it helps keep us from drifting into false teaching. However, despite this, I'm assuming Arius must have been a really nice guy to hang out with, because he still has clout. Like he's supposed, like he's exiled, but you know, he's still kind of buddies with people, and he's ends up getting sort of connected with the higher ups in the empire. And there actually comes a time where this is a hotly disputed topic, despite the fact that they already had the ecumenical council that decided it clearly once and for all. And the man who brought the charges, Alexandria, or Alexander of Alexandria, which is a pretty easy name to remember, he dies shortly after the Council of Nicaea. And it's going to be up to his follower to kind of hold the line, hold that Nicene orthodoxy. However, in the meantime, something happens that's kind of important. Arianism is spreading. Arianism is actually sending out missionaries, and they're sending them north into some of the Germanic tribes. And that's important for the future development of the Western Church. There are Christian heretics in the north, in the barbaric tribes of Germany, Germanic tribes, that have sort of an understanding of Christianity, but they have a deficient view of who Jesus is. But this is still an important, I would say, providential thing that's happening. In the meantime, in the east and farther south, St. Athanasius of Alexandria, who might be my favorite guy in church history, is towing that Nicene line. He is the guy that takes over as the bishop in Alexandria, and he spends his entire lifetime fighting to keep the church pure and keep it from drifting into Arianism, to hold the line to the confessed faith of the Nicene Creed. He says, talking about Jesus, he became what we are so that he might make us what he is. And he doesn't mean the second person of the Trinity, but he does mean sinless and in communion with the Father. And so he writes extensively against Arianism, and his most compelling book is called On the Incarnation, which is still in print. You can still read it. It's accessible. It's a great book. It just shows how good the instincts of the early church fathers were. Like, he is on it in understanding how important the incarnation is to our theology. Yeah, Joe.
Does he explain what he means by that statement? You can look at that.
Yeah, right. Because obviously he's not saying no. And if you read on the incarnation, you can see very clearly that it's God can only say. God has to become man in order to save man. Man cannot save himself. And that's what he's trying to say. It has to really be God who becomes man, or we're still in our sins. Because that's what the only way we can be brought back to God is if the sinless man who is God saves us. So that's really what's coming out of this phrase or this saying. But he ends up becoming the first of what I like to call the A-team. Athanasius of Alexandria, Ambrose of Milan, Augustine of Hippo, Anthony the Hermit, and Jerome, because no man-made system is going to work perfectly. But these guys become some of the pillars of this era of the late 200s, really into the 300s, and on from there. Athanasius being the first. He is just like, he's kind of like the most interesting man alive, kind of a thing. Like during this time where he's the bishop, it's Athanasius against the world. Like some of the emperors have converted to Arianism. Like everybody's slipping away from the Orthodox faith, and he is towing the line despite the entire world going in the other direction. He doesn't care. And so he ends up spending 17 years in exile, over 5 different exiles. This is how back and forth things go during the life of his ministry. It was, and so he becomes, I mean, the victim of all kinds of political smearing and accusations. Just 2 of my favorites, I'll read for you real quickly. They alleged that Athanasius had murdered a bishop, Arsenius, and cut off his hand and was using that hand to perform black magic. So, hey, the problem with that accusation was that Arsenius was still alive and had both his hands and defected to Athanasius's camp. And so Athanasius is called before the Council of Tyre in AD 335 to respond to the charges. He arranges for Arsenius to be there, but disguised in a scarlet cloak. And from the article I was reading about this, the author says, despite everything, the church's last champion of orthodoxy still retained his flair for the dramatic. Because you can see, like, the guy walks in with the cloak and says, aha, I'm here, look at my hands, I got it. So this is what's happening to Athanasius. Another time he's accused of having infidelity with a nun, which obviously would be a bad thing. And when she brought charges against him, a friend posed as Athanasius at the accusation, and she pointed at the friend saying, yeah, that's the guy. And so then he's like, well, that clearly is not true. And so this is what happened. But he was also forced to hide in the family burial plot, which was probably in a cave for years on the run. This is supposedly the bishop of Alexandria, which is one of the most prominent, important cities of the day. This is what C.S. Lewis had to say about him. His epitaph is Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world. He stood for the Trinitarian doctrine, whole and undefiled, when it looked as if all the civilized world was slipping back from Christianity into the religion of Arianism, into one of those sensible, synthetic religions, which are so strongly recommended today, and which then is now included among their devotees, many highly cultivated clergymen. He didn't write that this year, he wrote that in his day. It is the glory, it is his glory that he did not move with the times. It is his reward that he now remains when those times, as all times do, have moved away. And that's a good summary. C.S. Lewis actually writes the foreword for on the incarnation, like for the modern version that's still in publication. So if you get on the incarnation, get the one with C.S. Lewis's foreword. There's some other guys that eventually start to join the cause. Basil the Great, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzus. These are the Cappadocian fathers, and they start pumping out a bunch of books and writings to really bolster Athanasius and finally come alongside him. So it's not him versus the world, he's got some buddies with him. And slowly but surely the tide turns, and Arianism is forced farther and further to the edges. We could go into a lot more detail on that, but I should probably continue to move because we don't have a whole lot of time left. The chili is getting ready. The second guy on the A team is Ambrose. He's the Bishop of Milan. And he really doesn't have a ton of theological training, but he's got 2 key points in church history why he's worth mentioning. He is tenacious against Arianism, first of all. He refuses to go along with it farther in the north. And I mean, they try to take his church, they're threatening to burn it down, and he holds the line. That's one thing. Secondly, though, he opposed the emperor to his face. So we're talking in 390. The emperor of the West, Theodosius, had a riot in Thessalonica, and he responded with brutal force and killed 7,000 people. And Ambrose said, that is sinful. Like you overdid it. you went above and beyond what you're called to do. And so he made the emperor, the emperor of the Roman Empire, do penance. He had to do public confession before. So this painting is of him not letting the emperor into the church. You were not allowed to partake of the Lord's Supper until you publicly acknowledge your sin. So he stood up. Remember, this is within 2 generations of being a hunted minority, persecuted. He's telling the emperor to his face, you need to confess your sin and repent. And he does. Says that he knelt and begged God's forgiveness before the whole congregation with sorrow and tears streaming down his face. So not only did he oppose him, but it worked. The emperor caved and agreed that what he did was wrong. The other thing that's important is Ambrose's connection to the next guy who's a titan of the church, and we won't be able to finish on, but I want to start. And that is Augustine. If you've heard of only like 2 or 3 people in church history, Augustine is probably one of them. And no matter what church you went to growing up, Augustine was seen as one of our guys. He's one of the people that everybody wants to have in their camp. And Thomas Aquinas won't even get that. But Augustine, everybody wants. And it's because Augustine was the most important theologian since the apostles, and probably since then till now. I mean, he's really a foundational one. He wrote Confessions and The City of God, which are still relevant books. But he started out as a pagan. He had all kinds of problems in his early life, and his conversion was a slow process. He had had a child out of wedlock. He was kind of a tutor and highly educated. He was doing all that stuff, but he wasn't a Christian. He had kind of grown up around it and forsook it. And then slowly but surely over a process kind of came back around to it and got to a point where he's crying in a garden and hears a voice saying, pick it up, read it. And like many of us probably at random times in our lives, picked up a Bible and fell open somewhere and read the first thing that he found, which, hey, it's probably not the best way to go, but it is a way. And he read Romans 13:13, let us walk properly as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and sensuality, not in quarreling and in jealousy. And then he was baptized by Ambrose, who had been a mentor to him and who he thought was kind. Just point out.
He had a famous quote, Lord, make me pure, but not yet.
Yeah, that was pre-conversion, just to be clear. But I just thought it's interesting. There's a peacock in the painting. So there's that Christian symbolism. But we are over time and the chili is waiting, so we will stop there. We will get into why Athanasius or Augustine and Pelagius had about next week. So thank you. I'll get to make sure I get this.